Good evening, everybody. My name is Stacey Campton. I work at Ngara and I've been at the university for 4 years this year. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we meet today and pay my respects to the language groups of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present, and also to acknowledge my fellow countrymen in the room, like Vicky. So tonight we're gathered here to hear a seminar series or a discussion or probably an opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Mark McMillan, who is a Wiradjuri man from Trangie in New South Wales. Us mob call it tragedy. just so you've got a little bit of stuff on him, but it's Trangie in New South Wales, which is out past Dubbo. He is a professor and the Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Education and Engagement at RMIT University. Mark started with us in 2017, in March 2017, yeah. So it's just over a year. Mark's a lawyer by trade, an academic researcher in constitutional law and Indigenous rights, and a black man who has a strong desire and will to advance Indigenous self-determination for our mob. Mark has lots of awards and masters and doctorates and all of those things that make him an academic, but the one dearest to his heart is his grad cert in Wiradjuri Heritage, Language and Culture from Charles Sturt University. That's what he tells me. So we're here to discuss Bundyi Girri in some aspects, but also reconciliation and how Bundyi Girri fits into that space. And Bundyi Girri is a Wiradjuri word for shared futures, or what we're saying is what is to be shared in the future. Is that correct? Yeah. So this seminar series is a series of discussions designed to ignite conversation and to spark change. Change in how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples' culture and heritage is viewed and consumed by non-Indigenous people. Change in the relationship we want to see nurtured and matured, and change in our shared future. I give you Dr. Mark McMillan.
Two of the most important things in my life, a microphone and a clicker. Thank you, Stacey. I'd also like to also acknowledge the Boonwurrung and the Woiwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded land we gather tonight and on whose unceded land we conduct the business of the university, of which we have been welcomed by Kulin. But those welcomes actually are conditional. It's not just be happy, be here. So we actually are paying what is the requisite amount of obligation to what the conditions of that welcome are. And we all, if we pay attention when we are given a welcome, that we don't just sit back and passively wait for us just to do our business. In Wominjeka, as both Nawi and Ani Dai talk about, Wominjeka isn't merely welcome. It's not passive. It is the requirement to actually state what is your intention and what is your purpose. And that's an activity. It doesn't have to be a really difficult activity, but it's got to be an activity nonetheless. It's not just a mere cultural comfort that we actually passively sit and think the high watermark of a welcome is just that, hearing the words from an elder, hearing the words from a sovereign, hearing those words of welcome from people who have knowledge, hold knowledge and practice knowledge. And so in that vein, I acknowledge not just Eastern Kulin or Kulin nations properly, but all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and nations across the continent that is now Australia. And I pay my respects to also to other Aboriginal people in the room and Aboriginal elders in the room. So Also, a big shout out to one of our DVCs, Callum Drummond, Professor Callum Drummond, who is the DVC of Research and Innovation. Thanks for making it, Callum, because now I can actually say, somebody's got to fund this. Right. So, but the talk tonight is about trying to actually think about what is the role of a civil institution? What is the central role of a university in our reconciliation activities? But also understanding what has been the role of the universities in getting us to this point. Not just getting us to this point of we're ready for reconciliation. What have been the university's role as knowledge producers, knowledge conveyors into the practices of institutions that allowed for, enabled and facilitated not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander dispossession of land itself, but facilitated the ongoing erasure of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, places and things from the national identity through its emergence. So it's not just merely how do we construct a different future, it's also how do we think and how do we know that a place of knowledge production, what have we been able to do in not just being complicit, but also accepting that it's also the role of the university to think us through and out of the conundrums that the thoughts and knowledges have actually produced as problem. So the wicked problems that we have as a society aren't merely happenstance, aren't merely evolution. If we do think and we do know that universities, whether you go back to Aristotle in 300 BC, the role of the university, logos, pathos, demos, is absolutely still alive with us as intention. But for blackfellas and blackfella knowledges, 300 BC is a blip in our knowledge production, our knowledge constellations, and our knowledge transfer systems. So what do these things actually start to do when we think, really, what is the role of an Australian university in reconciliation in Australia? And instead of going straight to Australia, I might actually start with a like jurisdiction, Canada. So earlier this year, the University of British Columbia, which is an important university in Canada, the president of the university, Professor Ong, Professor Ono, should I say Yoko, but I don't want to go there, that's a little bit too twee. But as president of the university and as a response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that has recently been undertaken in Canada, as a response to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal peoples of the 1990s, what this started to do is to actually think through how universities are starting to think about their role in the practices and policies of dispossession, dispersal and removal of First Peoples. And it's not a mea culpa, we're really bad and we'll leave it there. It was actually something more profound, something more important as a signal to us of what do we think we need to do as a university, as a civil, civic, public institution, that one of our central tasks is to shape the society in which we live. So instead of thinking through this, Professor Ono's talked about universities bear part of the responsibility. Not only that, universities also excluded First Nations people from education itself as a participator in the dispersal, dispossession and removal. They're not things to make us feel bad. And when you actually read the president of UBC's statement, actually see it live, you can tell, and he's not white. So you can see there that it's actually not about black and white. It is about being Canadian. It is about being, it's just about being in a space and a place that is mature enough to actually live and acknowledge the consequences of the past activities, not just as knowledge production, but the implication of that knowledge on the formation and practice of the society itself. And that's actually a good thing. It's not difficult. Nowhere in that does the president of the university talk about guilt or the need to have it, but merely the responsibility to know it. Know it institutionally and know it in ways that it doesn't just reproduce history, because that's what we tend to do in universities, not reproduce history, but reproduce knowledge, which is a big part of what we do. We also have a big role to play in innovation and producing new knowledges, but that's similarly built on the back of the knowledge systems that we know. So innovation is equally important in this as a dimension. How does the institutions start to push forward not its complicity, but I think that's tied into what the president was actually was trying to get to when he says, you can read it, so I don't really want to talk it through, but failing to confront a heinous history, even if it is one that we did not cause, it is to become complicit in its perpetuation. They're strong, they're powerful, but gee whiz, isn't that full of opportunity? Because then it's not up to the First Nations, Inuit and Métis to carry the burden of a shitty history. But it opens up as an opportunity for the university and all of the people of that university that have their own knowledge systems, the disciplines, to open it up to a possibility, but one of responsibility to knowing. And knowing systems. I'm looking at Donna because it's good to see you. But if you actually start to read between the lines of what Professor Ono's actually saying, he's saying it's something that universities can't accept. It's because now that we know, it becomes inconsistent with the classical objectives of the university as a place that promotes critical and free inquiry, informed intellectual discourse and public debate. You might have heard those words somewhere else. You might have seen those words somewhere else. And if you haven't seen them or heard them, I urge you to look at the RMIT University Act, because therein you might find those words. Not Professor Ono's words, but the university is obligated. RMIT University is obligated as a public institution to engage in critical and free debate, inquiry, informed intellectual discourse and public debate. It is one of our objectives. And we carry those objectives because we're a university. So you can start to see and frame it around one of the vehicles of which we can actually attend to these objectives is reconciliation itself. Reconciliation is a vehicle, not merely as an aspiration. Reconciliation is a set of activities, not merely aspiration. And, as we will see, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but I'm quite happy just to stay with Aboriginal people at this stage, since the moment of contact, the activities of a relationship, what we now call reconciliation, has been our ongoing demand. But not just because it makes non-Indigenous people or institutions feel better about themselves, but as an ongoing demand as the practice of our own sovereignties. So we would never say we will be you or with you. We will say we are in relationship with you because you are here and you have been welcomed, but those welcomes are conditional, which is don't harm the children of Bundyi. don't harm the waters, don't harm the land. Yet, first moments of encounter, and for a couple of hundred years, there was the process of erasure of people. So we couldn't factor in to what was the conditional, but that has changed, and so what we've got to start to do is think through how we actually use the institution and the people of the institution as sites of activities themselves. So in Australia, we can say that there was even though Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been demanding a relationship, a sovereign relationship, not as expectations of rights recognition, but as mere existence itself. But in Australia, we had a formal recognition of reconciliation as process in 1991. So we've got to understand, where did that come from? It wasn't just happenstance again. So, like I said, we've always made the claims as Aboriginal people that our sovereignty is always present. I've got my 10,000 steps up. My watch just went off. So clearly flapping your arms about is exercise, so as long as that's recorded. But what we've actually been able to do is make these illustrations, make these identifiers, make these markers. Even though official reconciliation started as a process in 1991, it was on the back of 200 years of a relationship. And in those relationships have been ongoing demands, whether they're heard or not interested in, but those demands have been there nonetheless. And what we saw is ways that recognition could be done. So in the 1840s, Coolin sought segregation. Coolin sought segregation as a mode of keeping intact our sovereign identities. But segregation wasn't as a matter of control. That's how non-Indigenous people might see us. But the segregation was the practice that we are, or were within, the practice of our own sovereignty, and then there is that consciousness of border. And that border is not just metaphorical, it was actually hard borders. So we're actually starting to think about that we have been able to see, as a matter of our demand, where these things pop up. It also came up in 1967. People wanted to say citizenship and equality. How do we start to hear what were Aboriginal people saying? In the 1967 referendum, that was more about the transition for non-Indigenous Australians into the relationship. One way that the relationship could be referenced in 1967 was this idea of granting citizenship and equality. But it was to actually recognise that a relationship with Australia's First Peoples, sovereign peoples, was a requirement of the society itself. We were starting to move. That was reconciliation. But then when we got to the 1990s, it was on the back of... There were two important things happened in 1988. It wasn't just 200 years of impact. But it was also 200 years, we were celebrating 200 years. And during that time, does anybody remember it? I was so off my face, I can't remember much of it. But, they were our times. I was a teenager in 1988. Very drunk teenager, as it turns out. But you can start to actually go, there was political activism, not just of Aboriginal people. A lot of non-Aboriginal Australians were actually aghast at how we were actually celebrating 200 years of invasion, without reparation, without recognition, without that. So it wasn't just Aboriginal people protesting the bicentennial, but as a response to that, in 1988, in 1989, we had two important things happen to us as political organisation and as acts of reconciliation. One of those resulted in an Act of Parliament called the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation Act of 1991. The other was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission Act of 1989. So one of those two things sought to do two things. Did that just make sense? Those things sought to do two things. The first was organise us politically. So ATSIC was about our representation. our organisation, our self-determination. Albeit granted through legislative mechanism, it was still, the intention was not to continue to erase any more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander aspirations, political organisation, all of those things, but to actually give it a structured form of which the governing apparatus could actually deal with. It was actually a recognition of reconciliation. And then we had the... poor Lisa. That's all right. I hope it's a good call. But the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, its intention was to actually create, in Section B, a deeper understanding by all Australians of the history, cultures, past dispossession and continuing disadvantage of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. And this is where parliamentary drafters need to be punched in the head, of the need to redress their disadvantage. Whose disadvantage is it? But anyway, you can see this was starting to... you can see the gradual move here, the calls for equality, disadvantage, all of these things are actually saying, for reconciliation, this is what we can do. But in all of this... Oh, God, Linda. Shame job. I better turn my freaking phones off, my phones off. I didn't check. It just goes to show you two have got more friends than me because I don't. But what was absent for all of these things was the university. The council actually created a whole framework of education about Australia's shitty past and disadvantaged blacks. But it never created the idea, the framework, the infrastructure to start to theorise as to why reconciliation was now necessary for society as a whole. Instead, we got to the point of really what was being lost in that moment. And so it was about an educative process for non-Indigenous Australians about Indigenous people. It was effectively cultural awareness, couched up as disadvantage and deficit. Do those things still have resonance with most people? Because last time I checked, you didn't need your gaps closed. But we do as blackfellas. We're constantly monitored about our gaps. But our gaps of what? And we're saying that our gaps are closing when we have same access to opportunities of life than most of you do. And then reconciliation will be done. Can you see why outside of the university is actually going, what the actual here, people? We need a space where society can think through the conundrums that these things create. And it's our central obligation. Yet we passively bobble along going practical reconciliation. Anyway, we can see where the car was trying to actually recast the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians as being important. We were also in 1988, 2 years away from the passing of the Australia Acts. We were 2 years out of celebrating what this new Australia is. And you can see by 1991, Aboriginality was a really important part of that emergent national identity. Yet, that part of the national identity was being inscribed with deficit, gap. Well, they didn't say that at that time. That was Kevin Rudd's beautiful addition. But you could start to see how the relationship was being recast into a narrative of Australia as a form because, you know, do people actually understand the importance of the Australia Acts in 1986? Up until 1986, we were not legally independent of the United Kingdom. So when we talk about national identity and the formation of the Commonwealth in 1901, it took 1901 to 1986 for us to become independent. And once that independence was occurred, what we were trying to do then was going, well, what is our new narrative? And you can actually see it playing out today in the Houses of Parliament up in Canberra. of what that identity needs to be. You know, so as it still is with us that the national identity hasn't been formed nor practiced in the way that we need to have it done. But Patrick Dodson, who's also been and forever couched as the grandfather of reconciliation, I think, Jesus, that was a little bit ageist. He didn't start there as a sort of old fart. He actually started there as a middle-aged man, Aboriginal, so you'd probably say his life expectancy he should be over by now. But he, at 1991, was considered, and he was the first chair of the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, and he resigned from that position in 1996 after John Howard refused, or no, it might have been a little bit later, when the Parliament, John Howard as Prime Minister, refused to accept the Bringing Them Home report, which was about the stolen generations. He refused to apologise, he refused to do a whole lot of things. But in protest, the grandfather of reconciliation said, I can't do this anymore. As a matter of my own conscience, I cannot keep participating in something that the Australian people, as manifest through the Parliament and our executive government, says I can't agree with. But, you know, these words of Pat Dodson are really important. Now, Senator Pat Dodson, he's participating in the institution of governance for the nation. He's participating in shaping the national narrative, and he will bring all of this work into that. But where he said the schism between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, understanding and perspectives of how our nation's history has shaped the contemporary circumstance of Aboriginal communities and their relationship with the Australian state. And he goes on to say there is a discernible lack of appreciation by settler Australia about the grievances and sense of historical injustices that Indigenous people feel. We feel it. But what we offer up as a university is, how do we take what Pat has said, or Senator Dodson from Western Australia has said, and actually start to go, what is the central role of the university in bringing this to the fore, not as a moment of reckoning, or not as a moment of trying to do navel-gazing, white guilt, white fragility, multiculturalism, but as a mechanism to actually understand what is. The purpose of reconciliation is to keep the Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in a permanent relationship. Reconciliation isn't an end goal. And yet we need to have the universities accept that reconciliation in the form we have was never theorised. And this is where I give a call out to Mark Rosenthal, who's working with me on these things and works as an RA on the Bundyi Girri project. And it's been his level of engagement in trying to understand, well, what does a university do? But in first thing he did was we were trying to look at whether reconciliation for the purposes of an enduring relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians had actually been thought through. And quickly it was no. But we also said there's potential sources of transitional justice as a healing mechanisms in post-conflict societies. So there was a whole body of work, there was a whole body of literature that we might have been able to engage with as universities, as civil institutions, that might have given us a guidepost. But of course, when you start to actually think about the role of transitional justice as post-conflict, there you get the resistance politically that transitional justice, we're not even in a post-conflict society because we're not even in pre-conflict society. And yet, from an Aboriginal perspective, seeing it, feeling it, knowing it, we're definitely in post-conflict. So how do we actually start to go, there are mechanisms of which, because that ability to refute that we're post-conflict, that ability to refute the possibilities of framework of healing through transitional justice has been lost. Because, as Mark, I mean, this is where Mark's sort of academic side really flummoxes me, because it took me a while to work out what the hell is axiomatic. So, but he's true in what he's nailed, that reconciliation in Australia has been taken to be axiomatic, self-evident. Yet is it? Can it be? We're actually talking about the most fragile glue that is holding our societies together, which is the relationship between people and its first peoples, as if it's a given. And all of these acts are done. But what really is of note is what happened when we reject these ideas that transitional justice could never be applicable here. We make and reinforce the assumption that it was a peaceful settlement. Yet, our universities have made it very freaking clear that it was never peaceful. Every Indigenous Studies unit in every Australian university, every history department, every anthropological department has reinforced as a matter of its own knowledge base that Australia was not peacefully settled. Yet where do we start to hold that as truth? In our institutions. Again, it's not trying to make people feel bad. It's actually trying to say the universities are trying to actually place and keep up with the social movement of reconciliation. And we've got these sporadic, almost spasmodic moments of engaging with past, present, future around the reconciliation relationship. But therein lies the problem between the relationship between our Australian universities and politics. The politics of the nation in 1996 derailed formal reconciliation. Reconciliation under John Howard and what ensued for the continuing 11 years after that was the culture wars. Where were the culture wars being fought? In universities. You had Keith Winshuttle, you had Henry Reynolds, you had a whole mob of people going at each other through their knowledge bases. Oh no, that didn't really happen. Nowhere in there did we actually use the universities to go, really, what is going on? If the university's job is to shape and inform the society in which we live, where do we abdicate? Abdicate our responsibilities to our significant civil obligation. Because Howard and savvy politicians like him, it's not just a Liberal thing. The Northern Territory intervention and then its movement into stronger futures under Labor is equally ideologically regressive. Done under a particular way, but either way you look at it, it starved the Australian people of the ability to actually think what reconciliation is. Because under Howard, reconciliation became practical reconciliation. And what was practical reconciliation? A matter of activities that sought to close our gaps. And therein closed off the intellectual ability to actually take reconciliation on the proper journey it should have been on. So when we think about the bigger parts of reconciliation, the issues of sovereignty and self-determination, it became about that rather than about sovereignty and self-determination. Self-determination as parts of the national identities were starting to emerge from the 1970s. In fact, the Commonwealth, when it passed the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, had as part of its formal policy Aboriginal self-determination as one of its key drivers, not into land rights, but also then into other ways that we could actually know, how do Aboriginal people relate to the nation state? How do Aboriginal people relate to their country? How do Aboriginal people relate to other non-Aboriginal people? All of this was actually caused, and was caused, it's not just the schisms that Senator Dodson talks about, but it is also talking about the ways that practical reconciliation, even under-theorised as that crap was and is absolutely inhibiting us as universities to actually play our part in reconciliation, because we've kind of somehow said that practical reconciliation is what we participate in. So we do a lot of health research on Aboriginal people. We do a lot of research on Aboriginal people. But it's always from the deficit closing their gaps, therefore actually reinscribing practical reconciliation as the mode of activity. In other words, a myopic and continually myopic focus on the black body. So when we think about the emergence of Indigenous studies through practical reconciliation, we must think of itself, what are we actually trying to study? When you actually pull apart the curriculum of Indigenous studies as a mode of reconciliation itself, all you start to think that it is about is the past treatment of Aborigines and how we've interfered, we, in the big we, have interfered in their lives, and there's a nostalgia and a romanticism of Aboriginality past. Nowhere in any of the curriculum do we have reconciliation as a formed set of relationships where the major activity should be on non-Indigenous people. The focus should be mainly on non-Indigenous people in the curriculum through Indigenous studies. In fact, Indigenous didn't even exist until 1788, or Aboriginality didn't even exist till 1788 in Australia. We were just sovereign peoples. We were Gunai-Kurnai, Gungri, Wiradjuri. There wasn't just a pan-Aborigine. Yet we haven't theorised that. So we've now created in modernity a layering of what it is. And yet nowhere in our curriculum are we allowed to explore the complexity of the colonial encounter itself with respect to how it's impacting non-Indigenous people. Because we're forced into practical reconciliation so that we can overcome the deficits that we have created for Aborigines. So let's study at them, and let's call it practical reconciliation, because if we actually had the Gurras, it's a Wiradjuri term, I think you know what that means, to actually say, really, how do we theorise now as an institution in the course of our public obligation to actually shape the society, inform the society through free inquiry? How are we going to actually reinscribe that? And we have, unfortunately, a reason that we've actually just lost opportunities, and it doesn't make it wrong or right. I'm not trying to lay guilt at people. I'm not trying to lay blame on people. But we did lose some opportunities because we are, like every other public institution, not only were the culture wars actually affecting society itself, it was actually starting to affect the behaviours of people in the culture wars. So we were actually forced into it. But now with a bit of reflection, we can, like I said, we've got to actually take a little bit of pressure off ourselves that somehow we've been complicit as a university. We haven't. We just didn't know. And don't forget, we're also subject to, like everybody else, constant change. Society is moving at a fast pace. And for those of the academics in the room, society is moving much quicker than we can get a program off the ground. It takes 2 years to get a program through approvals. Yet society is actually changing at such a pace with respect to that it actually starts to become whether this is an ethical issue. So what are we actually doing? So we know operationally that we haven't done it, but the question is, instead of blame, guilt, it's now that we actually are on an ethical footing, should we have always been ethically obliged to engage with Aboriginality? Not as research ethics, and we all know where research ethics places Aboriginality, more practical reconciliation. If anybody's been through the national statement, you can see where research ethics places Aboriginality. It places Aboriginality in the form of not just deficit, but it goes a little bit deeper than that. Aboriginality is actually put in the category of people with particular needs, of children. It is actually problematised that we can never actually have in research ethics a sophisticated conversation about the role of Aboriginality, because we're actually seen from the get-go as being so deficit that we need particular protections in research. So you can start to see where this apparatus starts to let us down. But where we go as the sector, we've played along with it because what we've done is we go, look, one way that we can get involved in practical reconciliation is to have more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. And thereby, aren't we good because we're reconciling? Is numbers alone the issue? You know, we get funding to have more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, but we get money on the basis of underrepresentative groups across the spectrum, because that's an acknowledgement that society isn't, and the structures and systems isn't, even though desired, creating level playing fields. But we've swallowed up this, well, why do we want more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students? Not just as a response and make us feel bad, but let's theorise that. What makes us feel better of having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students? Because we know that going through education, and, you know, we've got some significant intellectual input or empowered people here, education does unlock worlds for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that's two-way. But that shouldn't be the sum total of the reconciliation moment. That is, because education isn't just an unlock for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as a form of reconciliation. Education for all people unlocks opportunities that might have been, historically, they've been locked out. And yet we know as a society, access to education is one of those key drivers in overcoming the underrepresentation and the possibilities of equality. So, but that's not the way that we actually theorise at the university why we want more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We do it because we think that is closing a gap, and that will lead to reconciliation. It will, but you've got three people in the room who go, yes, we're living testament to education does provide access and outcomes, but it also then places on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are educated additional burdens to do this kind of stuff. So you're actually going, education is a really important driver, but it's not just an Aboriginal thing, and we shouldn't be so lazy as to say having more students, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, is about reconciliation. No, it's just about the society that we live in, saying underrepresented people historically, access to education provides opportunity. Women, people with special needs, but that means everybody who is different has special needs. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we have particular needs to traverse education. So we've got to be able to say, well, where have we? But as we know, it's easier to implement an agenda of practical reconciliation than it is wholesale reform of the system itself. It's easier, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be the thing that we do. Because look what we've got. We at RMIT and every Victorian university since 2010 have this clause inserted into their enabling legislation. So the issue that we have is not whether we should, but the question should become, how does the university theorise this before we jump into it as obligation? So, you know, this is on the back of those iterations of society. This is on the back of society's transformation, society's desire. Where does society's desire to transform actually get its most manifest? And that's in the people who we elected into the parliaments that make the laws that we all agree to be governed by. Although you wouldn't see that in the Commonwealth today. So, you know, that letting us down as people. But it's still really important. This was put in our legislation not as a direction, but it was put in our legislative instrument as a way of opportunity. And the way of opportunity is to actually let's think it through, because it doesn't just sit alone. It sits, you know. We've got a group of objectives. This is the one we all cling to as academic freedom. But it's not. It's not just about academic freedom. It actually places us as one of the most important vehicles of which we can actually engage with the wider society. That's not just about academic freedom, which is you can't just say whatever you like. And trust me, I've taken on Andrew Boldt. I know that people can't just say what they like. But we've got, you know, in conjunction, we've got this next one, which is really important to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Teaching, learning, the advancement of knowledge. What are the things that a university does? And excitedly, you know, what it does is do this as well. It says there's two ways of looking at this. There's two ways of being in it. There's the non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and there's the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So it actually is, there needs to be discussions, activities, all of that about the relationship itself. And Meg's in the audience and she knows that we're trying to work up how do we actually understand the value of the relationship, the space between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Because everybody wants to measure Aboriginality as a cost, as an impost, but as obligation, rather than what we're trying to do is take the act and actually said, because this is the clangor. It's not just about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in isolation. It's not about public and free inquiry in isolation. It's all of these things taken together means that we provide programs and services that reflect principles of equity and social justice. That's opportunity right there. It's not just direction, it's opportunity. So I can't stress more strongly as an emergent idea the centrality of the role of a university in achieving reconciliation. We all desire it. We're all obligated to be in it. Yet, where do we actually start to now think of what is the role of the university in Australia's reconciliation journey that will go on forever? On that note, I will leave it there and ask for questions. Thanks. I didn't swear once, did I? That's for Callum. Fun. Any questions? Let's just questions.
Thank you, Mark. That was great.
Thanks, Lisa.
What happened in 1788 that meant the word Aboriginal and Indigenous entered the language?
The justification, the planting of the flag. So when Arthur Phillip landed in what is now Botany Bay on Gadigal country, there were Aborigines there. There were people there, and the planting of the flag created the Aboriginal right there. You can see images of it. So it actually became into the consciousness of how that place could be known for the British. Previous to that, Aboriginal, and the planting of the flag using the doctrine to, well, what was the justification for taking the territory? Even though they're physically looking at black bodies, they're saying, you're not here. You cannot be here for the purposes of us taking the territory. We don't have to deal with you because you are not human enough. And that was the Aborigine, that was the native. They used that vernacular, even though Arthur Phillip had instructions from the Colonial Office that he must treat the natives well, but he went one step further and just erased them by just not being human enough to engage with for the purposes of treating them well. So, yeah, it was in that moment. No, it was a really good question, because that was actually really important. To use the term Aborigine was the justification for not using other modes of lawful acquisition of territory. Terra nullius is a lawful mode of acquisition, but in 1992 the High Court said that was the wrong method. That's why we talk about unceded. There are three methods of gaining new territories if you are a colony, and that is applying the doctrine of terra nullius, meaning in Latin, empty land. But the worst part about it for Australia was they accepted us as people, but not human enough to form governing relationships of which they could engage with for the other two modes, which is cession, so you cede some of your sovereignty, or conquer, which is Spanish were quite good at it in South America. Like, you're either one of us or you're dead. It's that simple. So in Australia, we actually spent 204 years from 1788 to 1992 pretending that Aboriginal people were not here for the purposes of how we actually or how the British got to acquire the territory itself. And that was when you actually read the Mabo judgment, Justice Brennan was at pains to say, we can no longer continue this legal fiction. As a matter of human rights and morality itself, we can no longer continue this. And that's why unceded isn't a break in logic. With what happened in Mabo, unceded and recognition that we didn't ever cede sovereignty, because terra nullius is now put aside, we definitely say we weren't conquered, and the High Court also said there was no conquer and there was no cession. So we've got the doctrine of settlement, which is a new thing. But that's why Aborigine becomes important. And so how do we start to, through reconciliation processes, and we're doing that in all modes of recognition. Like 25 years ago, there were Aboriginal people. Now there's, in the vernacular of the people of Australia, there's Gunai Kurnai, there's Gungari, there's Wiradjuri. There's now a whole recognition process of which we're trying to displace or barnacle off the Aborigine and go, right, what sits below that? So it's actually kind of cool, but that is one of the responsibilities of reconciliation, I think. Don't you ask a question.
Hi, Mark. Are there lessons from New Zealand that we can bring to Australia, given their different relationship with the Maoris?
Yeah, they eat people. I think that's a lesson.
But have the universities in New Zealand had a different
I think they do, but it's a practice that's built over generations. So don't forget, so the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. We actually signed that as Victoria as part of the colony of New South Wales. So it was the colony who entered into the Treaty of Waitangi, not just the British Crown, but the colony to colonise over there. So we do have a treaty tradition in Victoria that we've been part of. But where it comes to the incorporation of Maori as more of a foundation rather than as an add-on, and I think we're struggling with that, you see a lot of positive engagement in New Zealand, bilingualism itself, national symbols of by cultural understandings of its existence, has always starting to possess. Now, I think the biggest lesson that I would take from Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the idea of Pākehā. So non-Maori in New Zealand, it's an identity, it's a way of being that isn't steeped in shit. It is okay to be a non-Maori, but by actually referencing yourself as Pākehā, you're also referencing Maori. And that's so cool. And the more non-Indigenous or Pākehā from New Zealand that gives us the opportunity to go, you can be part of the national identity and represent what those sovereign relationships are all of the time. It's actually pretty exciting. But in Australia, what we've got is non-Indigeneity as almost still toxic. It's still it's pejorative. If you go white in Australia, it's actually seen as pejorative. Whereas Pākehā in New Zealand isn't pejorative at all. It's actually a formal, stabilised relationship to Maori that Pākehā actually celebrate. It's okay to be Pākehā because it's also saying there's Maori constantly. So, I think there's some great lessons. The treaty will be a good one, the Treaty of Waitangi, but they ignored it for 160 years, and it wasn't until the 1990s that the treaty, the Waitangi Tribunal, actually came to life and enforceable. So they're doing some really good stuff. Donna.
Mark.
Donna.
Very interesting presentations and thought-provoking. I was interested in the RMIT Act, and in particular...
Donna works at Victorian University.
I do,
just have to
and I will be looking at the Victoria University Act and seeing if there's such attention given. So there's a clause there around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander aspirations, and I'm wondering how RMIT seeks to establish what that is.
Well, I think this, as a seminar series, is trying to actually explore that. The idea of Bundyi Girri started, and Russ, big call out to Russell Griggs. This time last year, Bundyi Girri was an idea. I would say this year, Bundyi Girri has become a way of being. So that's the way that we're trying to do it. There is absolutely, RMIT is institutionally in leadership, and so across people's and systems and processes, we're actually paying attention to where this actually can be put in. So we're not just saying it's an aspiration here, we're actually trying to embed it as a matter of practice. And Bundyi Girri, and this is where Stacey threw RAP 2, so we've got our first RAP coming to an end this year, and then the second RAP we're calling RAP 2. But we'll tart it up. We'll put in a cooling word somewhere. But they're the processes of really what we're doing in reconciliation at RMIT is moving people from being aware of Aboriginal people as cultural awareness to being aware of a relationship. And then Bundyi Girri comes in to support that as reconciliation activity to actually go, and the practice of the relationship is a skill, but it's also rooted in our RMIT values. So RMIT has a strategic plan from 2015 to 2020 called Ready for Life and Work. And there are 5 values in that. One of the values of inclusion actually calls out Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participation. What reconciliation is trying to do as a practice at RMIT is to spend the next couple of years maturing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander out of inclusion and create an independent value that sits alongside that called reconciliation itself. So we're actually doing a systems, cultural and sort of a transformation about where reconciliation actually fits within the RMIT framework. But it is operational, it is values-led, so we're trying to do it. Unfortunately, like other places, change is just so constant and so fast now. One of the dilemmas for us is the desire is so high, the appetite for this is so high, yet we have such a complex ecosystem. Trying to deliver it across everything where the desire and appetite is so high is proving to be challenging, would we say, Russ? Because one of the problems of getting so much interest is people might lose interest if we can't get to them quick enough. But one of the things that we actually, and you know, the person sitting beside you is leading this kind of thing, it is we're positioning reconciliation as not a value just for an RMIT employee. We're positioning reconciliation as the value of you as a person living in Melbourne with citizenship or whatever. So it is absolutely targeting it the you as a value proposition and then trying to match that up as a value proposition to the university's values. It's exciting to be at RMIT in this space, I have to say. It's a little bit fatiguing, but it's still exciting.
Thank you very much for the presentation tonight. It was really thought-provoking. It struck me when you were talking about practical reconciliation. That's quite a masculine way of getting something done. Men want to fix things, and I say that with due respect to all the men in the room. I'm not trying to be anti-male in any way. Whereas women tend to be more, well, how do you feel? How do you feel about this?
Yeah.
Let's talk about it. And so maybe the intellectual model that, if I'm correct, sort of underpins what a university is about, perpetuates that sense of practical reconciliation and doesn't necessarily provide a forum easily for talking about how we feel.
Sure. Thank you for that. The ability to actually become emotional through our values is the key. It's interesting, there's a work of a non-Indigenous Australian, Fiona Nicol, in critical whiteness studies that has provided me with some guidance on the issue that you just raised, that issue between masculine and other types of ways of being and how do we do this. One of the things that strikes me is what is creeping in through what Fiona talks about is this concept of virtue, and that without check or putting into a context is a real dilemma, because it will be very easy for non-Indigenous people to default into virtue of the way they're actually seeing their role. So it's not necessarily about masculine, feminine. It is about this consciousness of virtue that might really impede non-Indigenous people from truly having the emotional experience that you are talking about. So it's really important that, I think in answering Donna's question, that's where we're going with it. We don't want this to be something that you just have to do. If it doesn't resonate with you as a value, an internal value, something that you feel and emote, then we've fundamentally failed. But in trying to get non-Indigenous people here to do that very thing, there are instances of seeing that issue of virtue bubble. But you also have a very strong masculine, I don't have to do this, I've never done anything wrong. But that is an expression of emotion as well. The fact that it becomes a response that's an emotional response. It's not an intelligent or intellectualised response. But the responses have been on those poles that I talk about there, But I would have to say it has been my experience, and I sort of question the others in the Bundyi Girri project, I would say 90 to 95, if not higher, people are actually open and receptive to emotional responses to it. Because it also, Gabrielle's in the room, but it also is, belonging is actually something that we are doing not just as a theory but as a practice at RMIT, not just for students but for staff as well. There's a big issue of, that's also where we can use some emotional leverage into why it's about the individual. It's not about just RMIT compressing. But all of those, good call out about the emotions. They're really important, and if without them, this whole agenda is doomed to fail. Because if you can't be proud to be an Australian, which is an emotional response, then, we've got some work to do on making those people get their comfort levels up so they can be emotionally involved. I think one more, if there's no more, because we're already 10 minutes over, and that was beyond the promised time. Right, they've had enough. Bye. See you, Darren. Thank you so much for coming.